The NFL season is here, and today on Sports Around the Bar, we're going to be talking about both the AFC and the NFC North's predictions for the 2020 season. Let's get right into it and start with the AFC side of things, starting with the Ravens. Now, as you can see here, as I hope the graphic came up, you can see we have the Ravens going 12-4 and winning this division again. Last year, they made a historic run in the playoffs, especially with a young quarterback in Lamar Jackson. They look even better this year with additions like Calais Campbell coming in on the defensive line. Now, I know they've had a few subtractions. We're talking about Earl Thomas, especially on that defensive side of the ball, but that secondary is still stacked out with talent. They've now kind of improved the front seven of the group, and hopefully we'll be able to get more pressure on the quarterback. I see a 12-4 finish here for them. It's just hard to predict teams winning more than 12 games. They have to be a really special team for me to predict that. I think this team is going to be still the class of the AFC, and while I do have them finishing second in the entire conference, I see them going pound for pound with all of the best teams week in and week out. After that, we have the Steelers finishing in second place at 10-6, and this team last year was very, very close to being a playoff team. We saw the Steelers sort of limp through with bad quarterback play from both Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. This year, obviously, a lot of their success hinges on Ben Roethlisberger being able to play the majority of their games and start for them for the majority of games, because with him on the field and with slightly better quarterback play at worst compared to what they had last season, this is a 10-win football team easy. I think there's a chance that they might even challenge the Ravens for the division. But it's going to depend a lot on the health of these two teams, and it's going to depend a lot on the Steelers' skill position players, which I still see being one of their major weaknesses. Their wide receivers and even running back with James Conner, I know we've kind of had this experiment since Le'Veon Bell has left. To me, they're just not up to snuff. I think this is still the weakness of the team, especially when you compare to how the defense played last year. If they're going to succeed, we're going to need some of those guys to take steps forward in 2020 above what we saw last year. Hopefully, Roethlisberger can be the guy to get the most out of them. In third place in the AFC North, we have the Browns finishing at 8-8 and just outside of a playoff spot, in my opinion. First-year head coach Kevin Stefanski, following another first-year head coach in Freddie Kitchens, will be an interesting story to watch, no doubt, because last year, one of the biggest sort of issues with Cleveland, I felt, was their head coach didn't know how to keep everybody disciplined and keep everybody on pace. We're going to see if Kevin Stefanski's a different coach than Freddie Kitchens was, and I believe he can be. Now, that offense he has and has run out in Minnesota should fit what the Browns are trying to do, especially with a younger quarterback in Baker Mayfield. I know he's now moving into his third year in the NFL, but that offense that's more conservative, that relies on multiple tight ends and relies on the running game heavily, should be exactly what they need to sort of coach Baker Mayfield into a better position than what we saw from him under a Freddie Kitchens offense. I think they relied too much on him too early. Even though he has weapons, they asked too much of him, and I think that's why Cleveland has suffered in the past. I still think they have questions on defense. I still think their secondary especially is going to be a bit of an issue. Myles Garrett returning will be interesting to see and see what sort of impact he can make, and if he can almost do it alone up there in Cleveland. They have an offense that should jump off the page and put up a bunch of points. I like a lot of their skill positions in fantasy. The only downside to them, I would say, is there's going to be so many options, it's going to be hard to pick one if you're talking about fantasy football. But if we're talking about where they're going to finish, I think 8-8 is reasonable. I think it shows quality growth, and they might be one more good offseason away from making a playoff run, maybe even a deep playoff run with the way this roster is built. But for now, I have them just missing the playoffs. I have them finishing at 8-8. Finally, finishing off the AFC, do I need to say it? I think the Cincinnati Bengals are not as good as the rest of the teams in this division. And while I think a case can be made for all three of these other teams maybe winning the division, even a team like the Browns maybe winning the division, I don't think that case can be made for Cincinnati. I think this team is just absolutely lacking talent, and while they do have a few players on the defensive line like Carlos Dunlap that have been quality for them, they're certainly not best in the NFL level, and I think they're going to need a few more of those best in the NFL level guys that we can talk about that can be elite before this team is going to take a step out of the basement. I like the drafting of Joe Burrow. I think it's going to be interesting to watch how he and T. Higgins kind of get along, especially with A.J. Green starting to get up there in years. That's going to be a major sort of kind of connection, I think, for the next 3, 4, 5 years there in Cincinnati. It'll be interesting to see how they develop, and I think they'll get a lot of opportunities this year because this team's going to be playing from behind. Defensively, I don't think they're going to be very stout. Offensively, they have questions on the offensive line. I like Joe Mixon signing a new contract and sticking around for a long time, but We've seen it time and time again, and I think Le'Veon Bell is a great example of this. Having a good running back without much support around him when it comes to the passing offense and the offensive line, it's just very, very difficult for them to convert consistently in today's NFL. So I don't think Joe Mixon is going to be a massive success. He has some fantasy value if you're talking about it from that perspective, because he's going to get a lot of volume and he's going to get a lot of carries. I just think Joe Burrow's success this year specifically should be measured in how does he do in the opportunities he's given versus how many wins does this team actually put up. So I have them going 4-12, not the worst in the AFC, not the worst in the NFL by any means, but I think this is still probably a team that's drafting close to, if not in the top 5 when 2020 is over. Now, switching over to the NFC, we have, again, finishing in first place, in my opinion, the Green Bay Packers. This defense, I believe, is still built in a very interesting way. They're designed to beat teams like the Kansas City Chiefs that are very pass-heavy. They still have weaknesses up the middle, in my opinion, even though this team has sort of maximize its ability to get after the passer. I see them being more susceptible to teams that are able to run the ball with authority. I know the 49ers did it outside with a lot of off-tackle running against this team, and they weren't athletic enough to beat them to the sideline. I think they're still vulnerable up the middle as well. I think teams are going to be able to plow right up the gut, and it'll be interesting to see how these other teams in this division sort of react to that and how they take advantage of that. Outside of that, you've got Aaron Rodgers returning, and I think this might be the most motivated Aaron Rodgers we've seen in a long time, especially with them drafting another quarterback behind him in Jordan Love. It's going to be the story of the season, I think, in Green Bay is going to be what kind of Aaron Rodgers shows up to this new challenge and new sort of usurper now on the bench behind him. They need weapons. I know they signed Devin Funchess, who is sitting out because of COVID-19. I know that they have relied on guys like Adam Lazard and guys like Equiminius St. Brown in the past. I want to see one of those guys take a major step forward, even though I don't believe in any of them. I don't think any of them are going to be the next superstar, the next big weapon out there in Green Bay. I think one of those guys for Green Bay to truly challenge and really win a Super Bowl, they need one of those guys to step up and be an elite weapon as opposed to the guy who plays behind Devontae Adams. Now, running the ball, they've got a lot more interesting options because they just drafted A.J. Dillon, massive power back. He kind of reminds me of Derrick Henry that without the lateral mobility that Henry has. I think Dillon will be an interesting piece, and I think Matt LaFleur's time in Tennessee is kind of showing up a little bit with that draft pick. He wants the heavy back that can run with a little bit of speed as well. I think A.J. Dillon will fit that perspective. They also have Aaron Jones, fantastic running back that, in my opinion, has been massively underrated at this point. I don't like him as much in fantasy this year as I have in years past because I think his split now in Green Bay is going to be even larger with guys like Jamal Williams still on the team and A.J. Dillon coming in. But they now have a great 1-2-3 punch at running back. It'll be interesting to see the actual sort of makeup of this offense and how much they actually ask Aaron Rodgers to do and how much they ask him to throw when they have these 3 running backs on the team already. I see this team winning 11 games. I think they take a small step back from last year. Again, they won a number of games very close last year, and aside from the 49ers, they look pretty competitive in most of their games. I just see a minor step back when it comes to that because of sort of their susceptibility to the run. I think teams will kind of take advantage of that and try to run the ball on Green Bay a little bit more. Moving down the list, though, let's talk about the Vikings next, because these next 2 picks, when you see the Vikings and Bears, up until they announced Mitchell Trubisky being the starter in Chicago, I had these 2 teams flipped. I see the Vikings as one of the major losers in this year's 2020 season, and the reason I say that is because of all the departures. They've lost 3 of their top 4 cornerbacks to free agency, and while granted, none of them were very good in the first place, it's still just an impossible hill to climb, in my opinion, when you lose that much talent out of the secondary and struggle to replace it with anybody else. I think they're going to be very susceptible to the pass. I like them bringing in Yannick Ngakoue because without him, losing Everson Griffith would have hurt a lot worse. When you talk about the rest of this defense, I think they'll still be pretty stout against the run. But I think they're going to have some issues covering the pass, especially with quick hitting passes that are able to get the ball out before the defensive line there in Minnesota can make an impact. They'll still be able to run the ball with Dalvin Cook. Their offensive line is going to be another interesting piece to watch because while they took a step forward and they were somewhere closer to average last year than they have been in years past, that's made a huge difference. I mean, Kirk Cousins is night and day different with an offensive line that can give him a few seconds to throw where he can stand still versus running for his life. This team, though, if they have any regression on the offensive line, this offense is going to struggle. I haven't even talked about Stephon Diggs leaving, another massive weapon, leaving for basically nothing. And I know they drafted Jordan Jefferson. It's just really, really difficult for me to pick a rookie receiver and say he's going to put up 1,000 yards, or he's going to be just the type of impact player that they lost in Stephon Diggs right out of the gate. So while I like the draft pick, I think this year especially, the Vikings take a step back because of just all the new faces coming in and sort of losing their mastermind. Another underrated and under-talked about piece is this team without Kevin Stefanski was not run very well offensively. So what are they going to do now that Kevin Stefanski is the head coach of the Cleveland Browns, with him basically out of town and not running the show there in Minnesota? Moving on to Chicago, I have them also finishing 7-9, but I have them behind Minnesota, having lost both of the games in the division to them straight up. This team, again, there's so many questions. This team, I could easily pick them to go 12-4. I think if they start hot with the way they start with the Lions on the road, and then they get the Giants, and then they get the Falcons after that, this team could win 3 games right off the bat and could have a pretty successful season. A lot of it's going to be dependent on Mitch Trubisky's growth. It's something we've talked about for years now with him. Even when they had their 12-4 season 2 years ago, and everyone was talking up Mitch Trubisky, I said he's got accuracy issues. He's got problems throwing the ball. The defense has bailed him out a lot. Last year, I think everybody came down on him a little too hard. I think everybody was ready to throw him out and say, it's time for a new quarterback in Chicago. And if they finish towards the bottom of this draft, I'd agree with that. Right now, where it stands, I think Mitch Trubisky, I think the jury's out on him. I really do, because there's a very good chance he isn't the guy. But I think it's too early after just 2 years to say Mitch Trubisky can't be a starting quarterback in the league. So this year is going to be entirely dependent on what you get out of him. Their offensive line needs to play better. I acknowledge that. They need to be able to run the ball a little more effectively, and they need to set up an identity with that. I think they struggled with that under Matt Nagy last year at times. But I think when we're talking about the Chicago Bears, the 2 big questions are, what is Mitch Trubisky going to do? And can this defense play hard for 16 games? Can they be the elite group they were 2 years ago? Which I think the answer to that is yes. I think this defense kind of quit on the team a little bit last year when things didn't seem to pan out their way. And I get it. It's easy to get frustrated. The question is going to be, can this team start hot and avoid a lot of that frustration to keep the defense playing good for 16 games? Obviously, with a 7-9 rating, you see my answer to that is I don't see all of those things happening. I think Mitch Trubisky is going to have some more struggles this year. I think the defense, when we talk about them, I think they'll be very, very good and maybe even a top 5 unit again. But if this team doesn't start hot, it's going to be easy to watch them quit again, and I for one, can't blame them. Finally, let's round it out with the Detroit Lions. This is a lot of people's sleeper team. They finished a lot of games very close, even after Matt Stafford went out last year. My question is simply this. Are they going to be able to run the ball effectively? Because they seem to be entirely committed to that. They brought in Adrian Peterson. They drafted DeAndre Swift. They've had Kerryon Johnson, who, again, I think is a quality running back. So I was a little confused when they drafted Swift. And then the AP move on top of that just tells me they're done with him in Detroit. But they now have options at running back. Can this offensive line create enough holes and, with Matt Stafford throwing the ball, create enough running opportunities for these young running backs and Adrian Peterson to succeed? I want to say the answer to that is yes. And while I like what they've done on the defensive line, they have their issues in the secondary and at linebacker as well. I think this team is going to be, it's got a lot of swing potential. Detroit could be a 7 or 8 or 9 win team if everything goes right for them. Or they could wind up being at the bottom of the basement again because Matt Stafford gets hurt, or the secondary isn't very good and they're not able to stop the pass and they're having to shoot out on everybody and get away from that run game we just talked about. Detroit, to me, it strikes me that the Patricia era will probably come to an end when I'm thinking about it at the end of this year when they go 5-11. I think they'll have some success, they'll be in some close games, and then ultimately this team just won't quite have enough to make a push into positive territory when it comes to wins and losses. I see this as Matt Patricia's last hurrah as a head coach if he can't get this defense working right, because they brought him in to be the defensive guru. While I realize they've signed a few guys like Trey Flowers, they haven't quite invested as much as I would have liked to see on the defensive side of the ball. Their offense looks good, though. I think this offense will be very competent, and I think the defense will be what lets this team down into a 5-11 record this year.